Okay, welcome everybody to our new energy series, continuing with early career energy researchers. Today we have the pleasure of having Churchill Agutu from ETJ Zurich to speak with us about scaling off-grid technologies in Sub-Saharan Africa. Currently, Churchill is a doctoral candidate at ETJ Zurich, pursuing his PhD there, looking at off-grid electrification in Sub-Saharan Africa and the role of policy and finance. He also holds a master's degree in chemical engineering and Bachelor of Engineering honors from the University of Pretoria, South Africa. And prior to joining the Energy and Technology Policy Group, he worked as an analyst for a not-for-profit carbon trust, whom I know well as climate change advisor to the advisory firm Prometheum Carbon. So without further ado, Churchill, please take it away, and then we'll have a question and answer session at the end for those of us who are in the audience.
All right. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. So thank you, Stephen, and thank you so much for having me at the Irving Institute. I'm honored to be here, and I want to use this presentation to share some insights based on my research. And so today I'll talk to you about scaling off-grid electrification technologies in Sub-Saharan Africa. So as we mentioned, so my name is Churchill, and I'm a third-year PhD student at the Energy and Technology Policy Group at ETH. And we are a group consisting of engineers, economists, and political scientists. And our research focuses on technological change, policy, and politics in the context of decarbonization. And so my research is at this intersection between tech policy and technological change. And so while sort of most of the group focuses on the energy transition away from fossil fuels to low carbon energy systems, some work also focuses on this transition from no access towards access to energy services. And the aim of our research is to provide insight that can help design effective and politically feasible policies. So in terms of my research, what I'm interested in is understanding how the characteristics of off-grid technologies, so mini-grids and standalone systems, influence how they scale and they're deployed. I'm also looking at how we can use this understanding of technologies together with the understanding of the power sector and how these technologies are financed to improve electrification models for better policy decision-making. But then broadly, the idea is just to get a better picture of really where do mini grids and where do standalone systems make sense as electrification solutions. So my presentation has 4 sections. Firstly, I will give you just a brief background into the context of electricity access in Sub-Saharan Africa and how off-grid technologies fit into this conversation. Secondly, I will share some insight into how we can characterize off-grid electrification technologies. And then I'll give you a case example of how we can use this understanding to improve electrification models for evidence-based policymaking. And then finally, I'll highlight some key takeaways. So approximately 600 million people in Sub-Saharan Africa lack access to electricity. And the figure on the screen compares the total population without access to electricity in different parts of the world between 2000 and 2020. And we see that India has had the largest decline in the unelectrified population. Other parts such as East Asia and Asia Pacific have witnessed declines. But it's a bit different for Sub-Saharan Africa, where the population went up until 2014 and then began to decrease after that. So in addition to that, a large portion of this unelectrified population in Sub-Saharan Africa lives in extreme poverty. And so you can see on the screen, on the left, it's the percentage of the electrified population globally. And then on the right, we see the share of people living in extreme poverty. And we see that regions with low rates of electrification have high populations living in extreme poverty. But then finally, also from the figure on the far right, we see that there's some evidence that also points to the fact that that electricity access is linked to human development. Now, The United Nations, through the Sustainable Development Goals, has set a target to reach universal access to affordable, reliable, and modern energy for all by the year 2030, which is also Sustainable Development Goal 7 in yellow, as you can see on the screen. And so we have just about 9 years to bring this number down to close to zero as is possible. So it's a huge, and it's really, and it's going to take a lot of effort. Now, the good thing is that we have the technology that can allow us to reach the electrification target, and they can broadly be categorized into 4 electrification modes. So you have centralized grid extension, which serves different loads. And the idea is you have this central point of generation, and then you kind of transport the electricity to end loads through transmission and distribution lines. Then you have mini grids, which are larger off-grid systems, which are intended to serve large loads, such as aggregated communities, productive uses, such as milling and water pumping, and anchor loads, such as, say, telecommunications towers. And these schematics are just intended to be illustrative. So here, for instance, you have like 3 different communities being powered by separate mini grids. Then you have standalone systems, which can be divided into Pico solar powered systems and solar home systems, both of which are powered by solar PV plus batteries and incorporate appliances. But then more and more standalone systems are also beginning to, there are standalone systems that are also providing specific services. So solar irrigation, for instance, or milling. Now, so we have the technology that can allow us to reach to reach our targets, the SDG. Why then is the technology not scaling, and what is holding us back? It comes down to 2 things. The first is policy. And so the figure on the left is the World Bank's regulatory index for sustainable energy, which is a global scorecard that grades countries based on whether they have policies and regulation in energy. And I use this just to give you a bit of a picture of the electricity access policy landscape across the continent. Of course, it's not exhaustive, but in this figure, they particularly focus on electricity access. So red is for countries that are weak in terms of policies focusing on electricity access. Yellow represents sort of middle performers, and then green is for strong performers. So firstly, we see that there are 9 countries which are strong performers, and 2 of them include Nigeria and Ethiopia, which contribute significantly to Sub-Saharan Africa's unelectrified population. But there are other 37 countries which are still not there. However, even for countries that are strong performers based on electricity access policy, they're still not accessing the finance that they need to enable electrification. And that's the second factor, so finance. Now, so the figure on the right just shows the required annual electricity access investments compared to what was invested across different countries in the year 2019. So for instance, when we look at Tanzania, we'd see that from the policy side, we would see that indicatively it has the policies that are required for electricity access. But when you look at the financing requirements needed, you see that the country falls short. Then there's other countries where you lack both policies and financing to scale electricity access. So the Democratic Republic of Congo is one example. It has about a population of 89 million people, but it has one of the lowest electricity access rates across the continent. But further, when we then look at the annual financing, the annual investments that were made, we see that it's almost 100 times. It needs almost 100 times of what is being that what's being invested is almost 100 times less than what's actually needed. And so we can see that they still need to sort of address electricity access policy issues, but also the financing that can enable deployment of technologies. Now, mini-grids and standalone systems are 2 electrification modes that are available for electrifying areas that are remote and far from the grid. And when we compare them, we see that they have very different characteristics. So mini-grids, firstly, are physically networked, and they rely on sort of network effects and economies of scale in order to generate revenues, but they also require a minimum threshold in terms of the number of customers in order to be viable. Standalone systems, on the other hand, are not interconnected and they serve individual customers, and so they don't necessarily rely on shared infrastructure. They don't rely on a networked system in order to scale. And then secondly, when we look at technology economic lifetimes, mini grids require long-term capital commitments with payback periods between 8 to 15 years. And largely they depend on institutional quality. So the rules and regulations at national and sub-national level, which can vary depending on the country and the region that you're in. So for instance, you need exclusivity to a specific area for a long time as a mini grid developer to be able to recoup your investment in a way, sort of almost protecting you from like encroachment, say from the grid. But then standalone systems, you often have shorter payback periods, so about 3 to 4 years. And also because you serve individual customers, you may not necessarily need exclusivity to a specific region to deploy your system. Then thirdly, mini grids often need to be customized to specific contexts. So you often have to design for demand variations, which are uncertain. You have varied physical terrains and spatial distribution of loads, which influences how you design your distribution infrastructure. They also depend on the local institutions in terms of acceptance of technology. So you really need to get buy-in from the community before you even deploy the technology. With standalone systems, you really have a standardized product, which does not have to which is not always customized to a specific region where it's being deployed, but it can be easily demonstrated to users, which kind of makes it easy to gain acceptance and be deployed. So we can think of mini grids as sort of infrastructure-based systems and standalone systems as product-based systems. And these factors influence how they scale, but we also see these characteristics in how they are financed. So when we look at all the electrification modes, we see that they are financed differently. So grid extension has been the established mode of electrification and is typically owned by the government and financed through the balance sheet of the national grid company or through direct grants. Mini grids are typically financed and owned by private sector, in some cases by the state, and they are financed through concessional loans, the balance sheet of grid companies or through grants. And then standalone systems are typically financed by the private sector through the balance sheet of grid companies, and they're financed more and more through commercial debt, but in some cases they're also purchased directly by the customer. Pico solar powered systems are typically financed by the customer and through microfinance schemes. And so we have a picture of how these electrification modes differ in characteristics and how they are financed. So how then do we use these insights to better inform policymaking? So currently, governments in many sub-Saharan African countries and international organizations are now developing integrated electrification plans to determine which electrification mode is best suited to electrify a particular region and to chart their electrification pathways. For some integrated electrification plans, electrification models are used as part of this decision-making process, and they influence key decisions such as off-grid zones, which regions and technologies receive subsidies, how high should these subsidies be, and this has been made possible by the availability of geographic information system tools and data. An example of this is shown on Rwanda, is shown on the right. So that's Rwanda's national electrification, of the map of Rwanda, which is the national electrification map, and it shows which regions are to be electrified by which mode based on integrated electrification, an integrated electrification model. Now, these models typically select the most appropriate electrification mode based on least cost, which is a function of the financing cost. And to put it simply, you can think of the financing cost as the rate of return that you expect when you invest in a project or a company. Now, these models ignore the sources of finance and typically assume a uniform financing cost across all electrification modes, and they typically assume a uniform financing cost of 8%. And this can lead to unrealistic electrification outcomes, considering, as we've seen, the different electrification modes have very different characteristics and are financed differently. And so together with colleagues, we wanted to find out then how does the financing cost influence integrated electrification model analysis outcomes. And so we approached this this problem in 4 steps. We first of all began by defining different electrification financing scenarios for different electrification modes, so grid extension, mini grids, and standalone systems. And then we estimated financing costs. The financing scenarios were based on 3 factors, so the sources of finance, the country-specific risks, and the electrification mode-specific risks. We then estimated the financing cost for each scenario, and then we applied it to an electrification model onset, and then observed and analyzed the outcomes. And so I'm just going to talk to you about the different scenarios that we defined. The first is the uniform financing scenario, where we assume a uniform financing cost of 8% across all electrification modes and all countries across Sub-Saharan Africa. Then the second scenario is a public sector financing scenario. And so in this case, we're basically saying that the government is financing all electrification modes. And then we have the niche financing scenario, which is kind of representing the status quo in electrification finance. So in this case, you have the government financing grid extension, and then the off-grid options are financed by private sector. But then also in this case, this scenario represents a scenario where the off-grid sector is still relatively nascent and it's still not well established. And then finally, we have the mainstream financing scenario. And so this is similar to the niche financing scenario in terms of who is financing which electrification mode, but the only difference is that in this case, then the off-grid off-grid electricity sector matures. So the tiers in the model are based on the World Bank's multi-tier demand framework, which defines the quality and quantity of energy services that can be provided to household residents. And so for this presentation, I'm focusing on the results for tier 3. And so based on Moody's rating and a risk-free rate of about 2%, we were able to get the country differences in financing costs across Sub-Saharan Africa. And you can already see that there is a variation between the financing cost across the different countries, ranging between 3% to 19%, where Sudan is the riskiest at 19% and Botswana is the least risky at 3%. And you can already see the variation is much larger than the 8% value that is typically assumed. And when we looked at the niche financing scenario and looked at the off-grid electricity sector, we found that the financing cost then ranged between 15 to 32%. And then when we look at the mainstream, where sort of the sector matures, the financing cost ranged between 10 to 26%. Now, what you see on the screen are the electrification results showing the electrification mode per region across the continent in 2030. So the grid extension is blue, mini grids are red, and standalone systems are yellow. And so, and in the figure, the x-axis shows the different financing scenarios. The y-axis shows the percentage of new connections as of 2030. And the columns, so if you look at A and you look at B, these represent 2 different electrification pathways. So A was what we refer to as the extended area extension pathway. And it just means that the model was executed to allow for all electrification modes, and selection is based on least cost. And then the second pathway B is the existing area extension pathway, where in this case, we omit grid extension and allow for electrification through off-grid options or through grid densification. And these pathways just represent sort of 2 extremes in terms of possible electrification pathways. And realistically, the actual pathway would fall somewhere in between. And what we see is that there's a decrease in the share of mini grids by 7% for the extended area extension pathway. So A, when we compare the niche scenario to the uniform financing scenario. And then when we make the same comparison for the existing area extension pathway, so B, we see a significant decline of 25% when we account for the niche and the niche financing conditions compared to the uniform financing conditions. And then when we look at the investments, so C and D, again, C it represents total investments for the extended area extension pathway. D is for the existing area extension pathway. We see that the niche financing scenario, in the niche financing scenario for the for C, the total investment is much higher, and that's just because of the switch to grid extension. And then for D, the values, the total investments remain more or less the same. But then we also see from both A and B that access to public financing or mainstreaming of electrification financing results in relatively similar electrification outcomes. And then this is intended to just kind of show like sort of the map of Sub-Saharan Africa and the electrification outcomes. So again, A is sort of just uniform financing for the extended area extension pathway. And then C is uniform financing again for the existing area extension pathway. And then as soon as we account for the niche financing conditions, we see that it's less red. So you have, and you have, so basically you have a decrease in the share of mini grids, which kind of just speaks to the fact that, to the point that standalone systems may also have a bigger role to play in electrifying the continent than has previously been assumed. You also get some interesting findings when you sort of zoom into the countries. And so here what you're seeing is the percentage of new connections on the far left, and then electrification outcome map for the niche financing scenario in the DRC and Ethiopia. And here we're looking at, when we look at the graphs, we're looking at the different financing scenarios. So the uniform, the niche, and the mainstream scenario. And you can see that in the DRC, you didn't have a significant decline in the share of mini grids compared to Ethiopia, and this is just largely because the DRC has very high density, is densely populated, and so they're able to achieve economies of scale when they deploy mini grids. But then when you kind of look at Ethiopia, where you have more regions with low population densities, then if you don't actually account for the niche financing conditions, you may underestimate the share of the role that standalone systems could play in your electrification plan. And so these are really just the three key conclusions. The first is that technology inherent characteristics are important in understanding how off-grid technologies will scale across sub-Saharan African countries. Accounting for electrification mode-specific risks is crucial to ensure realistic electrification modeling results. But then also based on the niche financing conditions results, policymakers should, in addition to mini-grid policies, also consider the policies that can foster deployment of standalone systems as an integral part of their electrification plans. Thank you. In addition to that, I also just like to thank some of my the team that I worked with in working on this paper. So Dr. Florian Egli, Professor Nathan Williams, Professor Bjarne Steffen, and Professor Tobias Schmidt. Thank you.
Thank you, Churchill. That was great. I really appreciate it. And for those who are in the audience, please use the Q&A approach to ask some questions, and I'll go through some of those. And while people are adding some questions right now, Churchill, maybe I can kick things off. I think one of the things that's really interesting about what you just presented is it sort of takes an integrated look at, and not an advocacy look at, the different ways in which people can receive electricity. And so often I found in sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world, there's a camp that's all for regular hub and spoke, large scale energy generation of whatever type. Then there's people who are just really focused on mini grids, and then other ones on standalone solar, and then those who are down really at the pico level of, solar lanterns and stuff. And why do you think that is? And in what ways can your work I think helps shape people to think about an integrated answer, or to use a British phrase, horses for courses. When do mini grids make sense? When do standalone systems make sense? And what kind of financing mechanisms and what should the cost of that capital be?
Mm-hmm. So if I understand correctly, you're wondering why these sort of different camps supporting specific technologies, or
rather than an integrated view, because it often isn't done that way.
Yeah. This is kind of the way I kind of view it. I think that it begins with, first of all, just if we kind of look at how we bring electricity to people, typically, I mean, grid extension has just really been the established approach to sort of providing electricity access, right? And only recently, because of reductions in technology costs, then the off-grid sector is sort of picking up. And I think what happened is that initially there was also this assumption around sort of demand, right? That we have access to the grid, and now we can bring the same level of electricity to sort of everyone, right? And then we kind of went in and started deploying off-grid options, and started seeing that, okay, maybe in some of these regions, demand is actually not as high as we had perceived it to be, which sort of then led to sort of this move towards mini grids and standalone systems. But then there's also always been the view also and the understanding that, energy and electricity, energy access sort of leads to development. And so you kind of need to provide as much kilowatt hours that people can use to consume electricity. And so I think that's kind of what led to sort of the idea behind establishing sort of like mini grids. And then once again, when we started seeing that demand is much lower, then we kind of went to standalone systems. So I think it's largely this idea around demand and the fact that access to electricity is important to development. And so we need big sort of energy systems to sort of provide that. And I think so a lot of momentum has sort of been built around specific technologies. And as a result of that, I think only now is when we are starting to sort of, now that we're seeing that, context is very, very important. Now that we're seeing that when you have different actors providing these energy services, then the risks that they place on these investments are very different. It's then sort of getting us to sort of have to rethink again, then what is sort of the most feasible solution towards electrifying specific areas. And I think it also, and this is why I also talked a bit about sort of the characteristics aspect of it. So when we're looking at like mini grids and standalone systems, we have this understanding. We have this when we kind of characterize them, we see that mini grids are sort of networked, and they need this like lump, or almost like an initial lumpiness in order to be deployed, and that has huge impacts on sort of how it scales. So broadly, I think those are sort of the drivers, sort of demand and how it changed, but then also the technologies becoming available, and then also the sector, the different actors sort of starting, new actors coming into the space and changing how we think of, I'll say the best, let's say the least cost, the best way to bring energy services to people.
Great, that's really helpful. And maybe just sort of building on that a little bit, there's a question from Megan, which I might phrase the following, which is, what are the things that are most critical to make mini grids viable? Why would you pick mini grids over something else? And so the question from Megan really is, well, if the financing is different, would that steer you towards using mini grids, or is it really necessary that you be in densely populated areas?
I think it's a loaded question. But I would say it depends. It depends on context. So I would say, I mean, what demand would probably be like one of the most important ones, right? And we've seen like through the model that even in the riskiest countries, if you have enough demand, at least from a modeling perspective, then your LCOE is much lower. But I think that the choice between, again, it depends on the actor, right? So if the choice between mini grids and standalone systems largely depends on really the actor. So if you're a private sector actor, then it's really the cost of capital, right? So what's the return you get for the investment that you're making in a specific area? And that again, like for mini grids, you would really again need high demand, but you'd also need like sort of like a flat load profile. So it's basically enough demand to actually make your system generate the returns that can warrant its deployment. So broadly, I think it depends on the context. It depends on demand. It depends on who is financing electrification. And maybe just adding, if I kind of just, I don't know if I can share my screen quickly.
Sure.
This is just another interesting finding. It's also, when I talk about who is financing it, when you look at here, so you can see that. So if you kind of have like public sector financing electrification, for instance, then you might end up having, say, mini grids being possible as electrification feasible solutions in some areas, as opposed to if you kind of have only private sector taking on that role. So it's, so it's a play between demand, the actors, and who is financing the technology.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And, you know, and maybe I might just add to that, you know, for people in the audience, that there's two really big factors that are important for any electrical system. Doesn't matter if it's standalone, full grid, or mini grid, that really determine what Churchill referred to, the LCOE, or the levelized cost of energy, which you can broadly think in the audience is what you pay for that electricity. And one is the capacity utilization. Is the equipment well utilized? And I think the point you're making there, Churchill, is if you have enough load and it's of the right profile, you know, flat would be nice, or maybe centered on the middle of the day.
Yeah.
Then the equipment you put in can be well utilized. And by that, we mean it's being utilized 60, 70%. And in fact, there are not economically viable grids in the world that have capacity utilizations that are low. They have to be high. So that's one thing. And that is related to population density, but more important to the point you made, Churchill, the amount of power that's being drawn out in that square kilometer or 4 square kilometers or whatever it might be. The second thing, and your study also makes this clear as well, the cost of that capital. So your equipment can be really well utilized, but if it costs a lot of money to buy it or to borrow the money to buy it, then you're burdened with onerous interest payments. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, maybe the thing I'd be interested in hearing a bit more then is like, historically in the global north, people saw utilities as safe bets. The cost of capital was low because people, once they have electricity, they're going to pay to keep their electricity going. Mm-hmm. But we've run into this problem in Sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world, developing nations, where it's actually, mini grids are perceived as quite risky. And as you pointed out, people are borrowing capital at 15%, 18%, 25%. And at those kinds of costs, it doesn't matter how great your load profile is, your cost of generated electricity will be high. Do you have any thoughts in sort of from the policy side about how we could change the perception that these things are really risky, or what would need to be demonstrated to help the markets believe that they're not as risky as they perceive them to be?
For both mini grids and standalone systems, or the off-grid sector in general, or just?
Yeah, well, let's start with mini grids, and then if you have any thoughts about the standalone solar side of things.
I think the major challenge with mini grids, at least maybe I'll speak for, I do some work in Rwanda in terms of my research, and that's one I can speak to, is sort of this issue of the fact that grids and mini grids are serving similar customers, but grids are sort of publicly owned, and mini grids are more private. The kind of private sector has been sort of designated that responsibility, and then you end up having situations whereby the grid is sort of at more of an advantageous from a cost to the customer. The grid is sort of more advantageous because it's just cheaper than the mini grid, which is really like at a cost reflective tariff, right? And I think that, so one of the things that really needs to be thought of from a policy perspective is sort of how do you sort of level this playing field, because that's really the only way that mini grids would really be viable options for electrification, at least from a cost perspective, when you're looking at the two relatively similar technologies financing the same customers. I think that there's still a lot of, we definitely need to spend a lot of time thinking really about like where mini grids are actually feasible electrification solutions. So, you know, when you talked about like flat loads or sort of the middle of the day type of load, and I think that for mini grids, it's very important because they need exclusivity to specific areas. And this is something that I think there are many countries across the continent that have this exclusivity policy. But I think that another very important thing is the certainty with regard to the implementation of this policy. So if you tell a mini grid company that, hey, we are giving you this site as a mini grid site, you need to make sure that you have a clear sort of pathway into, okay, what happens when the grid actually arrives? Is there some sort of compensation? But then also what rules and regulations are there to make sure that the mini grid is not encroached, for instance. With regard to standalone systems, I think that one of the things that I'm learning, at least from my work, is that typically we've sort of seen, again, like we talked about, like mini grids are sort of standalone systems that are product based, and you sell them to customers, and you don't necessarily need policies to allow them to really scale. But one of the things that I'm seeing is that you're getting to, in Rwanda, for instance, you're getting to a point where some of these markets saturate, right? So the affordability is still a really, really huge issue. And so even though you have a technology that's cheap, relatively cheap, you still have customers that cannot afford it. And so there have to be quite a few efforts in sort of making it possible, like creating policies that can allow for standalone systems to be sold to customers in this last mile region. So subsidies, for instance, forget it. It's sort of standards to make sure that, because a lot of times you also have standalone systems that in some regions where you have counterfeit products, so you need to make sure that you have standards that really ensure that good quality products are sold, because that also influences perception of uptake. So I think a lot of work just needs to be done from a mini grid perspective, just leveling the playing field and having them be like, okay, these are kind of similar technologies that provide similar services to some extent.
Yeah, that's great. No, it's helpful. And we got a bunch of questions here, so I'll try to get to some more of them. One of the ones that a couple of people have asked is, what's your thoughts about scaling? So, you know, if you put in a standalone system, suppose that made sense for you, or that was what was affordable, can that scale with your needs as it grows? And you might be running a small business or a shop with it or something like that. Or do you really have to at some point shift and go over to mini grids? Like, what are some of the demand characteristics that would push a potential customer or set of customers one direction or another?
So I'm declining to answer this question just because I'm not an expert in sort of demand, because I think this question is sort of moving in the direction of sort of like the energy ladder and sort of how does energy change over time and how do people use energy. I'm going to defer to June, who will be presenting next week.
Okay, that's great. Oh, that's great.
To answer.
Yeah, no, that's fine. And I can add a little bit in here just to answer the question for the person in the audience, is that, I mean, both can be scaled. And one of the wonderful things about the technologies we have available to us today is they can be made small and then scale them larger. And so some work that was done recently with the Rockefeller Foundation showed that you can develop pretty small mini grids, you know, 20 to 30 kilowatts, and then scale them up in 10 kilowatt increments. Similarly, you can put in a 500 watt or a 1000 watt home solar system, and then you just add panels and batteries. And so what's really nice is that there's actually the ability that both can scale, and they should be able to be scaled much more in tune to the needs as the needs grow.
Do you mean in terms of adding capacity?
You can just add capacity. And so it's not, both can be scaled is what I would say. There's another couple questions that are here from people saying, do you think mini grids or of this type could be applicable in other parts of the world, not just say the rural Southeast Asia, but maybe even in rural areas in the United States, or places where people are subject to more outages because of trees falling down on lines or ice storms? Do you see the potential to be thinking through, like in a sense, go backwards? The US is a fully developed hub and spoke grid, but is that really where it should be? And is there an opportunity for these to be mini grids to be economically viable in places that perhaps already have developed grid systems, but may be suffering from the potential for energy security, energy reliability?
No, I think it's very possible, especially with regard to this point that you made about resilience. I think another advantage also, and this is kind of is this point about actors, sort of who is responsible for providing these energy services in a space where you have the utility sort of taking on both responsibilities. Then it kind of they can take that onus to provide this technology, and so maybe in that case this cost issue this cost aspect may not necessarily be that much of an issue. So it is possible, I think, but you need to look at these aspects: who is providing these energy services, how much does it cost, in terms of providing them. I guess the cost of capital, if you're building a mini grid in Germany or I don't know Switzerland, for instance, may not be as high as if you're building it in DRC, maybe where it's high, at least based on our numbers. So maybe that is a feasible option in those contexts.
Okay. And then here's a question that's near and dear to my heart. I think, as you know, predicting loads in areas where people have not had electricity or they've had very unreliable electricity is extremely difficult. And many people have tried, and I think most would agree that it's somewhere between art and science.
Yeah.
So any thoughts you might have there about how to perhaps improve that, or are there financing mechanisms through microfinance that might allow the development of electrical systems, whether they're standalone or mini grids, that take into account that uncertainty and take advantage of the flexibility of both mini grids and standalone systems to be built up over time?
At least from an implementation perspective, I would say that just this point about sort of mini grids and standalone systems together and predicting demand to determine which is the most feasible. I think that at the moment you still really have these two parks, like mini grid companies and solar home system companies. And so I haven't really seen, maybe the only now are some companies sort of providing both energy services. And so I've not seen like any cases where, there's this possibility of providing these, like sort of trying to understand demand based on these two energy services and predicting, which is based on demand, which is the most feasible solution from a specific area. However, I think that at least based on some of the work that I've been doing, so one of the projects that I'm working on is looking at mini grids and standalone systems and seeing which is, just from a demand perspective, what's the most feasible solution. And I'm seeing that, so I was looking at the different techniques that you can use to sort of try and get to look at demand and try and predict them. And there's one that I've come across, I'm still looking at it, but maybe it's also worth exploring, is sort of like time series decomposition of loads and sort of breaking it down into its components and looking at cycles and trends and seeing if you can then from that sort of get a bit of a picture into what demand looks like. But generally, I can't see, at least from my own work, I can't see any that come to mind.
Okay. All right. Well, let me, I'm going to ask a question now that's kind of synthesizing some of the ones we have in here. And then I have to admit is an area of particular interest to me. And so I'll start with a preface. Like, one of the things that you could take away from what you've talked about today is that larger grid scale stuff is often done with state government financing, often in developing nations with concessional financing from the World Bank or somebody else. And so it's pretty cheap capital in the grand scheme of things. And so it, as you stated in Rwanda, it sets up this kind of uneven playing field for private sector people. And then the rest, the mini grids and certainly standalone, are often financed and developed and expanded by private sector companies. And they can sometimes get access to debt that's reasonably cheap, but not as cheap as perhaps real concessional debt. But then they often have investors, and those investors are looking for risk-weighted returns that are on the order of 15 to 20%. So with that being true, what about the idea of member-owned electric cooperatives that are nonprofit that start with the customer's perspective on what electricity would be used for, welding, irrigation, milling, and then use that as the foundation for the load, and then be able to build whatever is mini grid, combination of mini grid and standalone, that creates an economically viable answer from the beginning. And the customers who are the owners aren't looking for a 15% return. They're happy that it pays the cost and it can be reinvested in keeping the system going. How does that strike you? Like, and what might be the opportunities to do that, or why would it not work?
I think that's actually my takeaway and maybe answering your question. I think that one of the things that I'm learning about mini grids is that because it is networked infrastructure, because there's a minimum threshold of demand, because it's relatively large, you need institutions in a specific area for the technology to make sense. And you can look at it at any scale. It can be at national level. With your example, it's a local level, right? The only way that this model this approach to sort of providing an energy service would be possible is if you have, first of all, buy-in into the technology, but also some form of rules and regulations as to how this technology is governed to ensure that it lasts for the long term. And it can be many things. It can be from how do we make sure that this asset is protected? How do we make sure that if you have a region that's like we have a resource that's sort of shared, how do we make sure that everyone gets the same amount, or we all use it in such a way that everyone gains from it? If we're able to find a way to identify regions, like some institutional factors that sort of are similar in many of these contexts that make these technology possible, then I think that would be, regardless of sort of which approach you choose to, which model you choose to managing the system, you will be able to at least enable the longevity of this system. I think that's kind of the biggest point, even with mini grids, I think so. And so even as we think about like where do mini grids sort of make sense as options, in addition to thinking about demand, we need to start looking at regions where there are institutions. So if you have a market, for instance, that already has sort of some form of management, then it's very easy for you to go and say, hey, we have this project that we want to develop or implement. How can we sort of work together to implement this solution? So that's an example where you have an institution. But still, I think that even at a national level, it's still very important. Mini grids will only build their mini grid companies will only deploy their systems if they have exclusivity to a specific region, if they're guaranteed that the grid won't encroach them, that they will get a return on their investment. There's some exit strategy, and that you have talked to enough mini grid companies to know that this is really the point that sort of kind of pushes through. So I think that's really the main takeaway. But I think also in terms of sort of the best electrification approach for specific areas, I think again also like we're seeing that just from a cost of capital, at least at current financing conditions, there is a role that standalone systems could play. I'm not necessarily referring to solar home systems, but sort of completely decentralizing. And I think that there might be a space to sort of also think a bit about sort of where is that decentralization point, right? Like from a modeling perspective, but also just from an implementation perspective, right? Does it really make sense as a energy service provider if I'm deploying this technology in a region where, let's say, the institutional quality is not necessarily that strong? Does it actually, is it sensible to just sell them as standalone systems, right? And that opens up a new space to like the technologies that we develop for electrification, right? As we are seeing, standalone systems are also going beyond sort of solar home systems. You're now having like water pumps, irrigation, you're having milling as different options. And so I think there's a huge scope for us to sort of think a bit about these technologies, especially again, because of the SDG 7, I think that's another point, maybe also that in terms of scale, like if our goal is do we want to kind of scale quickly, or do we kind of want to get there fast, or do we want to get there fast and well, and that has a huge impact on sort of which technologies we choose as we go. And maybe just the last point is I think context is extremely important. We are reflecting it through the cost of capital and the risk between different countries, but it's very important to, I think, if you, for instance, in the DRC, we see that mini grids may have a huge role to play in electrifying the continent. What does that actually mean from sort of an implementation perspective, right? So the case for the discussion around like deployment of off-grid technologies in the DRC would be very, very different compared to looking at deploying it in Rwanda, for instance, where the grid is kind of has reached a large part of the country. And also like you have regions where demand is low, for instance, and in remote regions, for instance. So context is important, technology is important, and institutional quality is we really, really need to spend time thinking about it. Yeah.
No, it's a really interesting point around institutional quality. You can have everything else right, but if you don't have mechanism by which people can see why they want to have shared assets, and there's a collective cultural sort of investment in making sure that they stay working, et cetera, that's a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
Another question that's come, I mean, see what you make of this one. It's a good question though. So what are the main challenges you see that face the growth of mini grid adoption? Is it really around this institutional piece? the cost. What maybe I should say the top 2 or 3 things that spring to mind if they're going to play a real role, because they're out there, but the amount of customers being served and the total amount of power being generated is still pretty small, even after more than 10 years of effort.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I came up, for me, it's 3 things. I mean, demand is really the key one, right? I mean, that's why there's a lot of efforts around appliance financing, around trying to find ways to sort of make your load, have your load in a way that can generate revenue. Institutional quality, for sure. I think this I've mentioned it. I think also affordability. You know, it's your again, of course, I wasn't able to cover the vastness of electrification, and so here I'm really talking about remote rural areas where you're newly electrifying specific regions, and you have cases where you're bringing initially, now it's moving to the energy services, but initially it was really companies coming and selling kilowatt hours and people weren't consuming enough, and now there's discussions around appliance financing, but then there are new questions around, so who pays for the technology for these appliances? What are the business models around this? So yeah, I think it's those 3 things: demand, institutional quality, and affordability.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And maybe just for the audience's benefit overall, an analysis that was done at Rocky Mountain Institute in, say, 2016, 2017 showed that something like 95 to 99% of financing that went into Sub-Saharan Africa for energy access went to the supply side. And so, it's great that you can build dams or coal-fired power plants or solar systems, but if you don't provide people with affordable equipment to use it, you don't get much demand. And that's very different than the rural electrification programs that happened in the US, in Europe, and in Australia in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, where there was as much money that went into ensuring that people could buy things like washing machines or grain mills or refrigeration as there was to put money in to make sure they could pull power into their particular communities. I think, as you just indicated, Churchill, that's changing quite a bit. People have realized that missed opportunity, but that's sort of the historical context.
Yeah, I think maybe just also adding, I think another point also to also think about from this demand side is really the idea about like sort of priming these economies to actually need this energy. I think it's important to also think about it in both ways, right? Because you can bring appliances to people and everyone can have access to specific energy services, but that may not necessarily mean that demand sort of goes up if the quality of life of people also doesn't sort of improve, right? And I think that there's also sort of this calling towards thinking about, and it's being done, the discussion is being had, and you can, and this direction, it's headed in that direction, but sort of how do you also grow these economies? Because it's chicken and egg, it's the chicken and egg problem of, does demand come before access, or does access come before demand? So that's another aspect.
Yeah, and that's why I back to the point I made earlier, harping on it, is that, there's a school of thought out there that says the people who are best positioned to know what power can do for them are the people you're trying to bring power to. So if you turn it on its head and you say, well, let's start with those people and listen to them, you may be in a position to much better understand how to help them meet their needs. Because I think you just made a really important point, which is kilowatt hours, nobody's interested in, honestly, or kilowatts. What they're interested in is, something that is cold and doesn't spoil, something that can be converted into a higher value product, something that keeps medicine cool, or whatever.
Or a cold beer.
Or cold beer. Well, we used to say at Rocky Mountain Institute, cold beer and hot showers. And so it's the services that they care about. And so linking this all together with the 3 things you said, and that demand one is so important, but the real demand is what the services that people want. And, I think it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts about, they're very interlinked, because the load profile determines the equipment you need to meet that profile, and it can either make it more affordable and higher capacity utilization or not. And so it's just an interesting feedback loop between the ultimate customers and the services they want, and what kind of equipment gets provided by outsiders, or even if it's bought by the community itself, very much is determined by that load.
Yeah, I think as for me, I'm always just not an expert in demand. That's why I'm always like reluctant to speak to the demand aspect of things. But I think that again, time, like I think one of the most important, like from a sizing perspective, it's really again your load profile, right? And I think that as we look at electrifying off-grid areas where you're providing electricity through solar plus batteries, the battery has a huge influence on sort of the cost of your system, you know, and typically when you kind of look at like the load profiles in I think Nathan Williams also wrote a paper on like load profiles in Tanzania where they aggregated different profiles. You see sort of like you have this peak at night, you know, and so there's a lot of thinking also that needs to also be put around sort of, I think, reduce like from a cost perspective as a policymaker, it's really how do you also think of ways to reduce the cost of batteries in these contexts, because this is kind of also having a huge impact on your cost, in addition to thinking about sort of the load and kind of having the load in such a way that it makes the system a viable option.
That's great. Well, I think that's about all the questions I have. Let me just scan through here anymore. I guess one last one. Any thoughts you might have, and this sort of ties back to the application of mini grids in general, in terms of their reliability and their viability. One of the questions on here was like, well, what about Puerto Rico, where they lost all of their power during Hurricane Maria, and actually all the power went out last week again. Any thoughts about the overall reliability and viability of mini grids?
I can't really speak to reliability. I think I kind of maybe can speak a bit to viability, but again, it still comes back to, I don't know if it's really demand, but I think it still comes back to that point around institutions. I think every time it always just circles back to, for you to have a viable system, you need to get buy-in from your community. First of all, that's the only way this, before you even implement the system. Then again, I think it feeds into this demand, sort of having demand initially and how that changes over time. I think, yeah, I would maybe point to institutional quality, but I can't speak to like, you know, what has been the viability of mini grids in specific communities once you've deployed it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for your time, Churchill. It's been super fascinating. It's an area of obviously great interest to many people, and obviously quite critical to people who actually would like to have access to reliable and affordable power. Any last comments before we finish up today?
No, I think thank you so much for having me. Feel free to email me if you have any more questions around electrification modeling, characterizing off-grid technologies, and sort of thinking a bit about like, you know, demand from on the ground, from a cluster level perspective. I've spent a lot of time working on electrification models. So if anyone is interested, feel free to ping me. Otherwise,
that's great. Well, thank you so much for your time and for joining us from overseas. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Stephen.
Yeah, take care.
Bye.
I think we're seeing your calendar there, Stephanie.
Oh, yeah.
And for those of you who are still on, here's our list of things that are coming up. We're looking forward to a number of different things, partnering with Rever Center, also Thayer School, and John Deutsch will be speaking in next week. So thanks so much, and thanks everybody for joining today.